Ciao, YouTube hunters. Brad Goodspeed here. So here's a quick little, not tutorial, but just sort of run through on how I made this prop weapon. I hate prop weapons that you buy in Halloween stores. I cannot stand them. That thick blade cross-section that you always see on those cast plastic weapons, I've seen people repaint them, and I've repainted them myself to look as good as possible, but that thick cross-section drives me absolutely nuts. So I like to make them whenever possible. Last year I made this weapon based on a prop made by the people at my favorite haunt, the Elizondo haunt in California, and it was very much inspired by that. I took a piece of driftwood that I got at the aquarium store to make the handle, put a groove into it, inserted a blade actually, and put rivets into it, and that's the way you build a real knife, and I found that's the best way to build a prop knife too. However, for this blade, I didn't have a piece of driftwood, so I just started with a section of PVC pipe. So what I basically did is just notched a little end in the PVC with my hot wire tool just to get something to start the saw into, and then I started working the saw down into it. This line is really uneven, but it's okay because you have to thicken the line so much later on in order to fit a piece of the plastic blade down into it there, that you can sort of correct the mistakes later on. And the way you do that is just, or the way I did it, is with a Dremel with a circular cutting edge attached to it. And as you can see, I've widened out one of the two grooves right there already, and that's how you can kind of recover your straight line. Once doing that, I just made sure that it fit in the middle of this piece of plastic. This is sheet styrene that you can get at a hobby store, a well-stocked hobby store anyways, a place where model railroaders and stuff collect. This is the kind of thing that people make the model houses out of and things like that. I got the thickest piece I could find, and that's what I use for my blades. Now, in order to make the rivets, you could probably use any sort of steel or aluminum piece you could find. I just use these little pieces of these little hooks that you get to hang tools on in a pegboard. I just took one down off my pegboard, and the cross section of the PVC was small enough that I was actually able to get two rivets out of this one piece. So I just cut those with my Dremel to make them fit. So I start with a piece of sheet styrene. I drew out the shape that I wanted, fit it into the handle to make sure on the right hand side there you can see that's the section that fits with inside the handle, and then it drops down, and that was the profile of the blade that I wanted. Basically I patterned it off of like an ancient Slavic blade, because that kind of goes with the backstory of my haunt. So I wanted it to be a rather big blade, but a lot bigger than like a chef's knife, for example, but smaller than a sword. So it's kind of like in between a blade and a short sword. And I basically use my, I put it into the vise and I use my Dremel cutting attachment to cut along that line. You want to make your line a little bit bigger than you eventually want to get to, because you're going to make mistakes. So once I have the blade cut out roughly, I start going at it with a circular sanding attachment on the Dremel. To start winding, cleaning it up and getting it down to the cross section of an actual blade, cleaning, sharpening it somewhat, but you don't want it to be too sharp, or what's the point of having a prop knife, right? Don't want to hurt people with this thing. In Alan Hopp's tutorial on making prop weaponry, he uses a belt sander, and I imagine that is a much better way to do it. I just don't have one. So after screwing around with it for a long time, you get it to a place where it can actually fit inside your handle, and that's when you put the rivets in. Again, I cut them earlier to be slightly longer than they needed to be, and I drilled holes that were slightly smaller than the diameter of the rivets, and then you just pound them through. If you have a drill press, that would be the ideal way to get the holes through the PVC and the blade and the PVC on the other side and hold it all nice and steady. I didn't have one, so I did my best. And then you just pound them through with a hammer, and that's good enough. Now, since the blade is hollow, things would move around quite a bit, even with these rivets, if you didn't do anything about it. So what I've done here is I mixed up a clump of epoxy sculpt, which I've used a million times in my other tutorials, and I've inserted it into the pipe here, adding more and mashing it down and mashing it down. until I couldn't really do it anymore. Didn't have to use very much, but basically you kind of want to shove it down at least further than that first rivet. And what you're doing is creating kind of a solid section of plastic inside the tube for that, so that knife doesn't wiggle around in there. And then this is looking down the barrel. I actually shoved some epoxy sculpt in there and used the back end of a pencil to push it up sort of around the second rivet, so that you've got, it'll be hard plastic in there again that'll bond very tightly around both those rivets, and then you're pretty much set. Then I just used the cutting attachment of my Dremel to clean up where those rivets hit the edge. And then another thing I did there, this was an experiment, but it actually worked really well. I wanted to put a wood grain into the PVC, so I just used the circular cutting segment of the attachment to the Dremel and just started running it across the tube really quickly, and it created this really nice wood texture, this grain, which I was really happy with, and I wasn't expecting. I thought I was going to have to completely cover up the handle with some sort of bandage to hide the fact that there was no wood grain, but that worked really, really well, so give that a try. Then I used just some sandpaper to clean up that blade so that the blade edge was really nice and clean. That notch that's in there kind of 3/4 of the way up the blade was unintentional, but I like the way it looks. It looks like the knife's seen some battle, or So basically that's the finished blade ready for paint. Then it was time to give it a base coat. I started with Krylon Fusion paint, which is made to stick to plastic. It's just a good way to kind of, if there's any holes in your paint job, to make sure you're not seeing underneath to see white. So I painted that and I let it cure. And then I moved on to the Brutal Rust that I talked about acquiring the other day. The first time I used it incorrectly, and I did not stir up the paint properly. I just shaked it, and I couldn't figure out why it wasn't reacting, but the reason is that the particles are sort of caked, the iron particles are caked down onto the bottom of the can, and you really need to scrape at it and scrape at it and scrape at it to get it all up and really well mixed in. And once I did that, I had pretty decent results. Here's the blade after my initial rust, and that was good enough for me. It's lots of texture on there and enough color for my purposes. A rusted blade, you think of, sometimes you look at it and you think, oh, it's not sharp, but what I want to do is create the look of a sharp edge. So I use this very waxy kind of paint that I found at the art store, which is perfect for this application. This is called Inca Gold, but the color is actually a silver. So what I do is I just dry brush it very carefully, right only on the edge. It doesn't look great close up, but when you look at it a little wider, it actually looks like a sharp blade. So then it was time to bring out all that texture that we created on the handle with the Dremel. So I just gave it a quick dry brush. This is after one color. I added in a couple of others afterwards. And I tore off a section of canvas drop sheet that I had. Very lightly brushed one side of the long strip with latex, and very lightly brushed latex onto the handle itself. And then wrapped the latex-laden canvas around, making sure to overlap each time I went around, overlap onto the previous loop of fabric. And you want to keep the latex, you don't need very much here. You want to kind of control how much you use, because it's very easy to use too much, and when you bind up something like this with layers and layers of latex underneath, it can take forever to cure. The little bit of browning you see there is that I don't like to wait for latex to cure, so I use my heat gun quite a bit, and I very intentionally brought the heat gun very close to singe some of the end fibers there, because I like that look. Then I basically gave it various washing coats of like leather dye that's been watered down and some dry brushes, and I wrapped this cord, I tied like a hitch knot, is it called, around one end, and then wrapped it around and around and around after painting a very light layer of latex again on top so that the cord would have something to kind of bind to. And then wrapped it around a few times, and then tied another knot, and then just again gave it a very light brush of latex on top of all of that, and applied the heat gun again to let it cure. And this is the final result. I like making these knives. All the actors want to have their own, so I have a few more to make this year. Again, I wanted this blade to look almost short swordish. It actually has extremely good balance. It feels really good in the hand, but the long handle kind of lets it look like it could be a one or two-handed weapon. So it looks very savage and very nasty. Anyways, hope you enjoyed this semi-tutorial, and I hope to talk to you all again soon. Happy hunting.